Hey guys, it's Matt from Eastwood over here in my home garage. We're going to do another quick little fun welding video. It's the top 5 reasons that your MIG welds might suck. So let's get started. Number 1 reason that your MIG welds might suck. So if you're getting a black sooty ring around your weld, maybe it's spitting and popping back at you more than usual, or you're getting some kind of pitting or pinholes in the actual weld itself. There's a few things that could cause that, and I wanted to cover the most common reasons that I find when I have that problem. So number 1, if you're seeing a sooty ring around your weld and everything on your welder settings wise seems to be fine, there's a good chance that you have dirty metal. What could cause dirty metal? So it could be anything from this first option here, where I just took an old piece of steel or an old car part that's been laying outside for years, has grease, grime, a bunch of rust on it, and you'll find that number 1, if it's extremely dirty or rusty, you won't even be able to start an arc. You'll hit the trigger and the wire will actually just bounce right off of your piece, and you may have to work around and try and get it to arc. So if you have to force it to scratch through the surface, your metal's definitely too dirty. Now another thing could be like this piece of metal here in the front. This is a clean piece of metal that I hit with the grinder, cleaned it all off, should be good, but it has some grease or residue on it that we maybe didn't notice or got on while we were working on it. And while we were welding, you will notice that it created that black soot right around it, actually made the grease kind of bubble up and get more liquid-like. And now you can really see the grease on there, whereas before it was just a real fine film. So that is a good instance where if you have a part that maybe was in use, but it seems like it's clean, but it has some oil on it, or maybe you sprayed some oil on it to keep it from rusting in the shop, that could happen. So the solution for these two is basically just to clean the metal really well. Make sure that you're using low VOC pre or acetone to wipe the panel down after you clean it with an abrasive method, whether it's a media blaster, an angle grinder, a DA sander, something to take all of that off, because you don't want to weld on something that has rust present. Even though the welder will be able to burn through the rust, you will get a weld that is porous and also is going to have a bunch of soot on it, and it's not going to be a strong weld. Now the last thing that could cause that is lack of gas flow. They may give you a false reading. So if you have too little gas, or you're out of gas, or you have a restriction in your gas. A common one that happens to me, aside from just not watching my bottle and running out of gas, is sometimes my nozzle will actually get a bunch of buildup of spatter on the nozzle from welding. And you may be doing a ton of welding, you don't notice it. Next thing you know, you're getting porous welds or getting soot around the weld like it's dirty. Check your nozzle, your consumables. Sometimes they get blocked up and it actually will block the shielding gas that's coming out of your MIG gun, and that could be causing your problem. So it could be as simple as just threading the nozzle off, cleaning it out on the inside, putting it back on, and you're up and running. So check one of those things, and usually one of those 3 or a combination will be what causes your problem for the number 1 reason your MIG welds might suck. All right, second reason that your MIG welds might suck. If you're having problems with your welds sitting high atop the metal that you're welding, where they may just knock off easily with a hammer, we have little piles of welds with a gap in between them. There's a few things that can cause that problem, and usually one of these are what causes me issues when I see that. So the first thing is simply the settings on your MIG welder. Getting a good MIG weld consists of mostly technique with the actual welding process, and more importantly, the settings on your machine, where you're blending the voltage or heat with the wire speed or the wire at the rate that the wire is coming out of the tip of your MIG gun. So when you blend the two of them together, you should get a really good even weld that's going to sound like frying bacon sounding. You're hearing spitting or it's pushing back at you, you may either have your heat or voltage set too low, or you may have your wire speed set too high for the heat range that you're currently in. You want to take a look at your machine, for instance, the Eastwood machines. Inside the flap of all machines or on the side of the machine, there is a chart that's like a suggested settings that will get you started, and you can at least dial in from there for your technique and your skill level. The other thing that can cause that is a technique issue. If you have your wires stick out too far, or you lift your hand while you're welding, or you start too high from the panel, you may have too much stick out and it's actually dropping the power. Even though you may have the machine cranked all the way up, you may be dropping the power of the weld because it's causing more resistance to jump across that long piece of wire that's sticking out there. What I like to do is use my MIG pliers and actually take them and run them against the back and cut them, and that will cut your wire to a good length, which is about 1/8 of an inch stick out from the end of the nozzle of the MIG gun. The other thing I like to do is try and keep a nice, steady, consistent height off of the panel with the tip of your MIG gun. So I usually like to be 3/4 of an inch to an inch total distance off of the panel, and you can adjust from there. That's a good starting point, and for you, you don't want to be too much more than like an inch or a little over, because you might start having that problem where it's going to start spitting or piling up for you. So if you go through those different things and see which one is causing your issue, a lot of times you will find it's one of those, super easy to correct, and you can be back welding and getting a nice strong weld. Number 3 reason that your MIG welds might suck is travel speed. Traveling too fast or too slow can create a weak weld and also something that doesn't look good. So I did a weld here where I moved far too quick across the panel. I had the correct settings as per the recommended settings on the welder, but I traveled across the panel far too quick. What you see with the weld is that it's kind of drug out and it gets very thin, and there's even almost some gaps in the weld along the way. And then finally, as I started moving extremely quick at the very end, I was actually moving quicker than the shielding gas was able to cover the area, and we started seeing some porosity in the weld at the very end, which obviously is going to be a problem. Now, if you're moving too slow, it's the opposite effect. You're going to start to blow through the panel. If it's something that's thinner, you may get a lot of warping in the panel. It may heat up and your weld will get extremely large. You need to find a happy medium where you're moving across the panel, pushing the weld as you go, making sure that you're kind of circling back into the weld to get nice overlap so there's no pinholes or gaps in the weld, but you're also not burning through. That takes a little bit of practice as you go, but if you get the welder set up as per the settings and tweak it from there, you can usually get really close by just doing a little bit of practice along the way. So if you make sure that you practice this one, there's not a lot that you can do as far as changing the welder, but it's more just sitting down and doing a lot of practice. All right, number 4 reason that your MIG welds might suck. If you're having problems with welding sheet metal in a butt weld situation where you're blowing through, as soon as you hit the trigger, it just blows through and you have a problem, there could be a good couple things that could be causing that problem. The first and foremost thing that I see a lot of times, even with people that have been doing it for a while, is the fit up of your panel. You need to make sure that when you're doing a butt weld of a panel that you have very little gaps between the panel, and that if there is a small gap in a panel, it is no larger than the size of your MIG wire, and it is a consistent gap across the panel. If you have a gap where you have a jagged edge that's cut and it goes from being too tight to open to tight again, you may have issues where you may set the welder up for a good fit up of your panel, and then when you go to an area that has a big gap, it may just blow through. The other reason is that there's nothing holding the panel from the back side, and you may blow through the panel because as soon as it touches it, the 2 edges that are cut and the gap, they are going to burn away very quickly and they'll just blow a hole in the panel. So if you have a situation like that where you have too big of a gap, you've already tacked the panel in place and you're kind of stuck, you can either use a copper backer to stick behind the panel to basically back the weld up, and it will help fill the weld up and the weld will not stick to the copper backer. Or in some situations, if the gap is pretty small and you have a piece of filler wire that matches the gap, like I have here, I have a piece of 3/32 TIG wire that I laid down into this gap, and it filled up the gap, and then I used it as my filler. Instead of trying to cut a sliver of metal and fit it in there, you can use a piece of TIG filler wire as your filler material, MIG right on top of it. It will burn the filler wire into the weld as well as your MIG wire, and it will fill it up and save you from having to cut the panel apart and redo it. But usually between those things, that's what your problem is, aside from just having your settings incorrect. The 5th and final reason on why your MIG welds might suck, or you're having a problem with your MIG welder, could be something that you wouldn't have guessed, and that is the input going into your welder. The power supply or power source that is coming into your welder could cause a problem and make your MIG welds suck. So you need to make sure that you have a proper breaker for your welder. Whatever welder you have, it will be in the settings or in the instructions that you could see what it requires for that welder. Now keep in mind, if you're like me and you use multiple types of welders, you want to make sure that you have a breaker that can handle all of those types of welders. So I use a MIG 175 for my MIG welder, and that can actually handle a 30 amp breaker, but I actually have the TIG 200 for my TIG welder, which I think needs a 50 amp breaker because I tend to do long runs at close to the max of that welder. So in that instance, I want to put a 50 amp breaker in my shop, and that's what I have. If you have too small of a breaker, like you're trying to piggyback off of a 220 line that is maybe running some home appliances like your washer dryer or something like that, then you may have an issue where that breaker is too small and you may be popping the breaker. Another issue at the source within your building or shop where you're welding is if you have poor or old wiring. If you have an electrical system where maybe it's piggybacked from your house or from another source, or it's just really old wiring, there may be a drop in voltage every time that it goes through those connections, and by the time it gets to your welder, you may not be getting the power to weld correctly, or maybe your welder won't even turn on. The final thing that I see is probably the most common thing when we have calls or I've seen issues with welders as far as the power supply goes is the extension cord that you're choosing. Not everyone has a shop where you can have a 220 outlet right by where you're welding, and if you're like me, you probably have a bunch of projects you need to move the welder all over your shop. In that case, you need to have an extension cord. Make sure that you're using a heavy-duty welding rated extension cord. For my MIG 175, I have one of our 220 welding extension cords that has big beefy wire in it that can handle running all the way across my shop without having any issues with dropping in power. The most common thing also is 110 welders because it is so simple to get an extension cord. If you're running a long extension cord like 100 foot or 200 foot to your welder, do realize that you're going to be dropping in power by the time it gets all the way to your welder, and you can't use an extension cord like you would use to run your Christmas lights on your house. By the time that the power actually gets to your welder and the draw that the welder has, you're going to have issues with your welder where you're going to get poor welds, or maybe your welder won't even turn on. So make sure you're checking the electricity in your shop. You can use a multimeter to check that if you want to check out and make sure that everything's adequate, or just take a look at all of your wiring as far as extension cords go and be sure that they are up to par. That's all I have for the top 5 reasons that your MIG welds might suck. If you want to check out all of our welding supplies and welders, you can click the link down below, or you can visit eastwood.com to get all the tools you need to do the job right. Thanks guys, catch you later.